Welcome to Equipping Leaders, a podcast where I share and discuss resources, tools, and information to equip leaders to build creative, cohesive teams through culture and leader development. Welcome to the Equipping Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Natasha, and today I'm sharing a conversation with United States Army officer Rob Massey on how we make decisions as leaders and how you determine the level of importance both for yourself and for those that you lead. Hello, Rob. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to have you jump in and introduce yourself and then tell us your style of leadership.
Sure. Thanks, Natasha. No, great to be here. So my name is Robert Massey. I work over here at West Point at the Army Cyber Institute, and then I'm an instructor. I teach project management in the Department of Systems Engineering. And I've spent a career in the Army. After graduating from West Point, I was an Army aviator flying Blackhawks in a variety of positions. And then I transitioned to become an acquisition corps officer, which really just means I help buy things for the Army, hopefully good things, right? That's what I've been doing for the better part of the last half of my career here in the Army. And so in terms of just leadership style, I guess I could tell you that I've experimented with them all. I've used them all, some with more success than others. But, I think, if we think about sort of transformational leadership, that's sort of, maybe it's grown into more of a cliche term, but I think my leadership style is really more, sort of collaborative and coaching. In other words, I don't think that I have the best ideas in the organization. In fact, I'm confident that I don't have the best ideas in the organization. So really so much of what I do as a leader is eliminating barriers, trying to reduce red tape, so that the workforce that has all the brilliant ideas can actually get those ideas to the surface so they can materialize into something big for the organization. So yeah, a little bit of coaching just in terms of just helping folks get what they need and eliminate what's a barrier, an obstacle for them, generate productivity, and then collaborative, trying to bring great ideas together to produce the best result for the organization.
I love that. And I know that in the past, they said there were like two types of leadership, transformational and transactional. And I think that as we move through our careers, we find that at times we have to be transactional, or the situation calls for it. But then most of the time we do try to be transformational, and not in this big, I know it's an overused term, so it does feel like a cliche, but it is in that, like, we transform as leaders and then we transform our organizations by, like you said, removing those barriers, understanding the people that are in it and what's important to them. And when we're letting them be in their strengths and then we're all pushing towards the same goal, I think that does ultimately transform teams and organizations. In your leadership origin story, if you will, was there a specific event that empowered you where in that moment you were like, I'm a leader?
Yeah, right. So you go to West Point, right? So you come here as a cadet at the United States Military Academy and sort of you're knighted, right? Oh, you're a leader, right? By virtue of your sheer presence at this leadership institution, you are a leader. That was really more sort of rhetoric than anything else, and certainly early on during your West Point career, right? So I guess I could say, yeah, there was this experience of coming to West Point that made me acknowledge that, my future would be in sort of these leadership positions. But I don't think the full, weight of leadership really hit me until really years into the Army, when I actually felt like I was responsible for somebody else. And even right before West Point, if I backtrack a little bit, right, I do, because what I want to do is I want to talk about leadership in terms of like an organization sort of identifying with a figure. And so I remember playing varsity soccer in high school and being the team captain and thinking, this team is going to take on my identity and my co-captain's identities, right? If we work hard, they'll work hard. We were seniors in high school, and seniors in high school aren't supposed to bring water out to practice, but that's exactly what we did because we wanted the team to sort of take on that identity. And so here I am as an 18-year-old kid sort of acknowledging that the moves that you make, the examples that you set will sort of set the tone for your organization. And so I know it sounds kind of silly to think, as a high school student, you could sort of get there, but I think that's where the concept of being responsible for other people, I think that's where it hit me first. But then years later, right after I graduated from West Point, I really think the true stance on leadership, at least as we perceive it in the military, the weight of leadership, the mantle, that responsibility of leadership, it really hit me hardest when I was in Iraq. And we had already been there, my goodness, for probably 6 months before this moment even happened. So even, months into a deployment, I didn't really feel, I knew I was responsible, but I didn't really feel that weight until we were about to go on a mission. And we had this historical problem of our machine guns, which would be the guns that sort of point out from the aircraft. On a Black Hawk, they're more self-defense than anything else, but they would jam up quite a bit with the dust. And so we would always just have these weapons jam every single time we tried to use them over there. And so one of my fellow pilots, he came up to me, he was a warrant officer, and certainly one of the more senior pilots that we had in the organization. And he came up to me and he knew that this mission that we were about to go on was going to require us to fly very low and very slow over some hostile terrain, over large crowds of people. And he didn't feel comfortable doing that with weapons that he knew jammed. And so as I sort of talked him off of the ledge and convinced him, hey, these are the mitigation procedures that we're going to put in place to make sure that what we're doing is safe, he pulled a picture out of his wallet. It was a picture of him and his family, his kids and his wife. And again, at the time, I wasn't married and I didn't have kids. And so that was the first time, I think, that I can recall where I actually stepped outside of my shoes and put myself in somebody else's shoes. And the weight of the decision, the weight of this decision to go do something that would be a little bit more dangerous than anything that we had done sort of sunk in. And so I guess I would say that was sort of the initial weight-bearing experience of leadership that I had during my career. There were moments at West Point where I said, well, yeah, I'm a leader because I came to West Point, and sure, I had these experiences in high school, but when it truly hit you, when you really felt the weight, the responsibility of leadership, that was the moment that I think I identify with most.
That's a phenomenal story.
Thanks, yeah. When these are hard conversations to have, right? Because again, I guess at the time I was probably, 23 years old. And here's this seasoned pilot who has been doing this for more than 20 years now, having this heart-to-heart with me. And if you can envision that, right, just take yourself away from that military environment and put yourself in that position of a 45-year-old husband and father talking to, for crying out loud, a 22-year-old kid, right? So, and asking, hey, can you do more for us? Because I don't feel safe. And I guess acknowledging in that moment that you owe this human being more than, just departing on this mission sort of without thinking through these consequences.
Sometimes it takes people a really long time to get to that place.
Yeah.
So it is so amazing that you were open to that and that he was willing to be vulnerable in that moment so that you could both be on the same page, and you really were able to step into that mindset of all the different things that a leader truly needs to think about.
Yeah, and that's a great word that you use there, vulnerability too, because that doesn't just happen, right? An employee, a follower, they don't just come to their supervisors or to their leaders and put themselves in that vulnerable position unless they trust them. And this might be somewhat tangential sort of to this concept of decision making as a leader, but I think it's worth sort of diving into a little bit. And that is, there was a lot of controversy with the Olympics over the summer, and Simone Biles, right? So one of America's rock star, superstar lead gymnast for the United States, sort of carrying the weight of the country on her shoulders. And maybe some of that was manufactured in her mind, but some of that was absolutely generated as a result of, just some of the social media dynamics involved with that. But again, going to her coach in that moment where she's supposed to perform for the United States and represent the United States and say, I don't feel comfortable, my head's not in the right place. And so there were those folks out there that sort of demeaned her, but there were also those that championed her and supported her. And I've seen that time and time again too, right? And so the story that I just shared with you is a perfect example of somebody coming to a leader and saying, I know I'm a great pilot. I know you need me for this mission, but my head's not in the right place right now. Let's talk through this. And that has happened to me on multiple occasions in deployed places. That sort of anecdotal story that occurred in the Olympics this year just sort of brought up that concept of vulnerability, right? If your mental health, your physical health, and acknowledging that both of those things are important. The level of trust and the level of comfort that you have to have in your leadership to be willing to be vulnerable. And ultimately, I think that makes organizations stronger too when you sort of cultivate that culture, right?
Absolutely. And since decision-making is one of the, of course, biggest tasks of leadership, your ability to have good depth in your decision-making, not just looking at, of course, like surface numbers and all that kind of stuff, but really the second and third order effects and who it impacts. I was talking with a friend the other day, and he just mentioned that his boss had said something, and then later he went home and he was just being kind of not great talking to his wife. And then he came back and he was like, well, leaders just do, they just can say whatever. And I was like, oh no, this is actually a great example as to why they can't.
Right.
Because if I were to say something to you, who cares? Right? I'm not in any position where you perceive the decisions that I could make impacting you in any way. But when someone is in that position, whether it's something as extreme as people could lose their lives, or as extreme as people losing their jobs, which is a very real fear that a lot of people have, and somebody can say just the littlest thing and it just sits in your mind, and then it comes out to everyone else. So as leaders, to just be, sometimes you have to be really direct and honest, and that's important. You got to be clear. But then at the same time, to really remember that all the things we say, all the things we do impact the people around us and their families and, their communities ultimately, which sounds big, and it is.
Yeah, and that's another important attribute of leadership, I think, and that is because we're all going to find ourselves in this position. We're all going to find ourselves in a position where maybe we say something that we don't mean. And if we haven't cultivated that trust with our workforce, then our employees will take that home with them. They'll stew over that. They'll lament over that. But they'll never tell us that we offended them inadvertently. And the next thing you know, you've lost that employee. And so this concept of trust, right? These things don't happen overnight. I mean, it's a day in and day. I mean, I always say leadership is hard, and the better you are at it, the harder it is, right? Because it takes time to get to know people. It takes time to cultivate that trust. But the hope is that if you can cultivate that, you won't have that employee take that remark that you made out of, maybe they take it out of context or they take it the wrong way. They won't take that home and stew over it. They'll confront you with it. And you can resolve the issue in the here and now, as opposed to just losing that employee potentially forever, right?
Yes. Recently, I was thinking about how lucky I feel and how lucky I have been to be in work environments where as inclusion becomes so much bigger and so much more, and people are allowing their whole selves to be at work so that they can do better work and so that their companies can support them in the ways that they need. I just think that I've been lucky to be in organizations and be in positions where when people say something, I'm glad that they say it directly to myself or to leadership, but that also we're willing to hear it and then we adjust.
Yeah.
The world's always changing. We know that. But especially when it comes to things that are pieces of someone's identity and how they live in this world, when we can really understand, we can respect boundaries, when we can understand and be open to learning different things, even if it's not how you, I hate it when people say this. They're like, it's not how I was raised. Okay, but you're alive in 2021. And it's your responsibility as an adult in the work environment to evolve. And that's a big part of it. And what's been interesting in the civilian world is to watch people really work through that and do it in as mindful of a way as they're capable of, but being super open to it.
it takes an incredible amount of, I don't know if it's emotional intelligence or what it is, but it takes somebody who's willing to listen, right? It takes somebody who's willing to change, not change who you are. That's not what I mean, right? Hopefully the decisions that we're making are still principle based, right? They're still values based, but sort of evolving in their mannerisms, evolving in their communication practices. All of those things matter. It's just that I think sometimes you run into this problem where, to your point, you have somebody that may have been doing it the same way for 30 years, and for whatever reason, they just believe that they're above it or they're beyond change. I think all that does is it stagnates growth in an organization.
And something that you said just kind of reminded me that as leaders, whether we're making decisions for ourselves or for others, that aspect of listening that is so important. And that's, they're like, oh, don't listen to respond. But also, if you're just listening to understand, you're kind of still missing things. And then I believe it's Oscar Trimboli talks about listening and being open to being persuaded. And I really like that, because then it's, like you said right at the start of this, where I don't have all of the right or all of the best answers. I have my ideas, but maybe yours are better or would work better in this situation. So I think that listening is also such an important aspect of decision making that is, I don't want to say undervalued, but it's not as talked about when we talk about decision making.
Yeah, so sometimes, to pull on that thread a little bit, is sometimes as certainly as leaders or people that are going to be put in the spotlight, maybe at times, we almost feel like we have to respond. We almost feel like I have to be the one that finishes the conversation because I'm the leader. And I guess how refreshing it would be to just have no response other than, wow, that's very thought-provoking. Let me take this home and think about it tonight. But yes, and I think that's probably another important attribute of leadership as well, right? That the willingness to change your mind, right? Politicians always get, hammered for being flip-floppers, but there's some merit to that, right? The willingness to be persuaded, so that you're not so deeply entrenched in your position that somebody who may come along with a brilliant idea or a brilliant argument, an incredibly well thought out argument, can't change your mind. And hopefully as a leader, you can put yourself in that position. Again, principled and value based in your decision making, but not so deeply entrenched that you're not willing to have your mind changed. Because again, if you're the leader, again, as I mentioned earlier, right? If you're the person who always has the one best idea in your organization, there's probably something hugely wrong with your hiring practices, right?
It's interesting too how when we put such high standards on leaders, we take away all humanity when we project onto a leader all these expectations. So whether it's a politician or whoever, but more importantly, when it's a leader who changes their mind and we regard them as flip-floppers, in Adam Grant's most recent book, Think Again, he talks about how people who are willing to take in the new information and rethink about it and then change their mind or adjust their prediction or adjust their decisions, they of course get better results because they're taking in what's current and what's new. And then people later, after slinging mud at them the whole time, but people later are then like, oh yes, this person is a great leader or is really great at these different things. So I think that's something that's so interesting. And I think it's in a lot of us too, where we don't want to be seen as flighty or flip-floppy. So we're like, okay, let me just take a hard stance. I think we could all just all take a medium stance.
For whatever reason, it became a wildly controversial subject, but right, the coronavirus is a perfect example of that, where our understanding of the virus and the resources that we have at our disposal to combat the virus have evolved over the course of the last year and a half, the last 2 years or so now. Doctors and health professionals knew a little bit about the virus initially, and then their understanding of the virus grew over time. The problem is, I think we had a lot of folks initially during the pandemic who made up their minds one way or the other as to how they were going to proceed with treating it, and they never wanted to be viewed as flip-floppers. And as a result, they were deeply entrenched in their positions. And here we are 18 months later, still sort of fighting that fight. So
Self-leadership also has a lot of important decision-making that comes along with it. I know that recently you had the opportunity to not accept a leadership position, and that how that all kind of worked out. So I'm interested in your decision-making process around that and how it evolved with you moving forward as a leader in the military.
Yeah, it was quite the evolution. So again, just a little bit of background, the way the Army sort of selects certain higher upper echelon leadership positions, it's somewhat of a competitive process. But again, depending on how competitive you are, will dictate sort of the position that the Army will give you. And so I submitted a wish list, if you will. The folks that were reviewing my application or my packet, if you will, said, yep, this person has the right qualities and attributes to take on this position that he said he wanted. Well, things happen. Look, businesses close, new businesses form, and the same is true in the Army, right? Army organizations go away, new Army organizations form, and it just so happened that the one that I had asked to get and got went away. It's no fault of anybody. But ultimately what the Army did was they said, well, that job went away, let's just give you this other job. And, we have a bumper sticker slogan in the Army, right person, right job, right time. That's the bumper sticker slogan we use when it comes to talent management. And so that bumper sticker slogan was going through the back of my brain. And I just said, this is absolutely ridiculous, right? You said I was the right person, right place, right time for this job that you gave me. Then that job went away, and then you just randomly gave me this sort of other job. So at first it was, a little bit of laughing, a little bit of frustration, a little bit of just anger at the sort of bureaucratic way that this all plays out. So I guess phase one is anger. It's kind of like going through the stages of grief, I guess, right? Phase one was sort of anger. And then phase two was just, look, you work in this enormous organization. And I've said this at many times during my career, right? So we're a bureaucracy, right? Probably the largest, most well-known bureaucracy on the planet. In order for bureaucracies to function, we have to have these processes. And 95% of the time that process works, and 5% of the time it doesn't. And those 5% are just going to have to deal with it, right? That's just kind of how the only way bureaucracies can exist. And so I just sort of fell into that 5% category. The next part of sort of dealing with this decision was, okay, do I take the job that they just gave me that I never asked for in the first place, or do I just politely decline? And so culturally, the way that I think that we train leaders culturally is unfortunate in a way. It's unfair. Because the rhetoric in the military is, hey, we awarded you, we recognized you with this position, this leadership position that not everybody in the Army, not everybody that you've been working with for your entire career is going to get. So how dare you turn this wonderful opportunity down, right? So culturally, that's the way we're all sort of raised. But everybody's probably heard the expression, the Army goes rolling along. It absolutely does, right? The moment I decided I'm not going to take that job, the Army went rolling along. They picked somebody else who was going to do a fantastic job, a very important job. And so I just sort of stayed behind in my current role. But you're right, it was a process. It was being aggravated with the system, and then sort of talking myself off the ledge and having a little bit of emotional intelligence to step back from the situation, ditch the ego, right? Leave the ego at the door and sort of make a rational decision, acknowledging full well that there are plenty of other Rob Masseys out there in the Army that are just as good, if not better. And they'll be happy to sort of take that position. So it was a long sort of convoluted process. But I think that what stood out to me more than anything else was just that cultural dynamic, right? That sort of self-induced pressure, because it's all self-induced. There was never one person out there that was telling me, Rob, you have to take this job. It was all sort of manufactured in my own brain, but it was as a result of cultural conditioning and the way that we are all sort of raised up as leaders in the Army to, look, the Army's giving you this amazing thing. How dare you not take this amazing thing? Things all sort of happen for a reason. And, at the end of the day, you as a human being have to be happy with where you are, because I think when you are at your happiest is when you are probably your most productive.
I love this story for a billion reasons. And one is that when we're making a decision, there's such an important aspect of knowing ourselves, but then also really understanding the system that we work in. The Army is amazing, and being a leader is an honor. Also, you're right, that cultural conditioning, that aspect of understanding yourself and then also really understanding the system that you're working in, I think makes those kinds of decisions. Yes, there's still going to be internal turmoil, and there's still going to be things to work through, but ultimately make them better decisions for both you and the organization. But if you get caught up in that, in what you've been culturally conditioned to do, then you're like, yes, I'll accept. And then you go on and maybe you're miserable, and then who suffers? Everybody does.
Yeah. And it's a fantastic point, right? Just acknowledging sort of, number one, your organizational culture, and then number two, the processes and the systems that are in place to help your organization operate, right? And they're going to be different depending on what type of industry you're in, right? Like if you're working for a startup with 6 of your buddies from college, it's a totally different sort of operating environment than it might be in the military, right? And certain industries have their own sort of cultural norms and organizational processes. And so understanding that is very, very important, not just for you as the leader, right? But again, getting back to this concept of sort of, building trust within your team. Look, leaders are going to be forced to make decisions sometimes that are driven almost entirely by the organizational processes that they just have to operate underneath, that they're governed by. And it's going to be frustrating to the workforce at times. But I guess if the workforce can understand that this is not my boss, this is not my leader's, call, I guess in a way it kind of is, but I can get behind this because my leader has fostered this culture of trust within his team, that I can get behind this organizational decision that's been made because I understand sort of the framework in which we operate.
One of my mentors from the military, Sergeant Major Will Reinhardt, he would say when you're developing, obviously you're developing the soldier, you yourself, you're developing as a soldier, then you're developing your team, you're developing, making the impact that you can on the Army. But when you're making decisions, it has to be inverted. It has to be, what are the needs of the Army, the needs of the unit or the team, and then the needs of the individual, because otherwise the Army can't run. Yeah. So in knowing people, there is an understanding of how you would deliver information, how you would try to make things as palatable as possible. But then ultimately there are things that organizations need to do that nobody just wants to sit around and make slides or, do admin work or whatever. But there are just some things that need to be done. And then especially when it comes to decisions, some decisions that are good for the organization. And then we need to help people kind of work through them.
And Natasha, you know this too, right? And Sergeant Major Reinhardt knows this too, right? There are decisions that will be made for us, but the organization gives us, the subordinate level leaders, the latitude to determine how we're going to sort of implement those decisions. And so not too long ago, the Army went through some extremist training, right? So we had an extremism stand down day. And so there were some folks that, they got the 150 slide PowerPoint presentation, and that is how the material was delivered to them. There were other units, such as ours, where we had some deep and meaningful conversations, some painful conversations. But in one instance, I think it was poor training that probably didn't hammer home the importance of what we were trying to do. And on the other hand, what you saw was leaders who said, the impact of this training is not going to happen via a 150 PowerPoint slide. It's going to happen by individuals having conversations and expressing their thoughts on this deep concern that we have within the military. And so in one case, the training was effective, and in another case, it was not effective. So again, the organization made a decision, but subordinate level leaders have the latitude to determine how they are going to go about implementing that decision.
And that's such a great point that leaders, one of their many functions is that how are they going to deliver this information? And I think sometimes people get stuck in this is how it was given to me, so this is how I'm now going to present it up to you. And I also think that, great on your group for having those tough conversations, because I think it can be so scary. And in that moment, you are being an exceptional leader in being very vulnerable and being open to those types of conversations. And I'm not saying it's an excuse, but I can see why many people don't. It reminds me of Michael Scott from The Office, who's afraid to deliver any true difficult conversations. He'd rather cry in his office. And then when he does try to deliver training, it's a nightmare, but not a great leadership person to follow. But when you are deciding how to get people to understand something, people don't learn from looking at PowerPoint slides. That's been proven over and over.
Yeah. And if we're going to do it, right, let's make it worthwhile. Physical training in the Army is another perfect example, right? Okay, I don't particularly enjoy getting up super early in the morning, but look, if I'm going to get up early in the morning, then the training better be worthwhile, right? It better be worth my while. And so somebody had better put some thought into that training, okay?
When you're looking at making a decision at the team level, how do you go about gathering information on how to make that decision?
Yeah, so certainly not a clean-cut answer, because they never are, right? It's the typical lawyer response here, right? It depends. Number one, first of all, we obviously need to consult with the lawyer, so we need to bring the lawyer in, right? This is sort of where my project management hat goes on, and I say, who all is going to endure the impact or the consequences of this decision? We need to know who those people are, because a lot of those people may not even be in our organization, right? Something as simple as a construction project here at West Point is going to impact more than just the cadets. It's going to impact, security personnel who are going to get people on and off the installation. It's going to impact potential donors and alums who might be giving money back to the school and are interested in sort of project status. There's contracts involved and going back to lawyers, right? There are lawyers involved. So, and again, I think the person making the decisions isn't going to be the person who knows everybody that's going to be involved in the process. And so there needs to be a little brainstorming that happens to figure out who needs to be involved in this decision-making process. And let's spend some time on that. We all want to jump to executing the decision that was made, but where we don't spend enough time is focusing in on who will be impacted by this decision. Because my goodness, could you imagine starting a construction project, but you forgot to let the security personnel know that a bunch of construction contractors are going to be driving their vehicles, and oh, by the way, they're bringing heavy equipment, and we never told the police to shut down this road so the construction vehicles could get on, right? So again, it can blow up in your face if you haven't properly communicated with people, not just up and down within your organization, but those folks that are impacted all around you. Another perfect example, right? We're talking about these ransomware attacks on the United States and Colonial Pipeline not too long ago. And okay, yeah, they're a private company, but guess what happened to the vast majority of Americans up and down the southeastern United States, right? Gas prices went through the roof. There were long lines to get gas. So yeah, I get it, you're a private company, but you have absolutely affected the day-to-day lives of most Americans in the southeast United States, right? So when we're thinking through, our sort of business model, our business strategy, when we're thinking through decisions that our organization is going to make, it can't just be, right, involving folks within our own organization. It absolutely has to. There isn't I can't think of a single business that doesn't touch some other aspect of society, that doesn't touch some other stakeholder that is not internal to their organization. I guess it starts with that, right? Like sitting down with your team to figure out who are we communicating with outside of our organization that will be impacted potentially by this decision.
Especially when you can get a broad group of people together. Sometimes someone who maybe you wouldn't necessarily think initially to invite into the room comes up with the most genius piece of the puzzle where you're like, I never would have thought of that.
Right, and that's a whole other, again, dimension of decision making. And that is, getting back to maybe this person who's been working at the company for 30 years and just doesn't want to listen to anybody and doesn't want to change. I mean, oh my goodness, like I don't think it's unreasonable for me to say that I learn an awful lot more from our students, our cadets here at West Point, probably than they learned from me. My former intelligence analyst in my company is now an editor for The Economist magazine. I had a crew chief who used to fix helicopters on my team, and he's coding for Microsoft now. And so I think acknowledging that our workforce is more than just a job title, right? There's way more to these people. To your point, bringing your whole self to work, being your whole person in the office and at the workplace to allow yourself to be as productive as possible. If you don't truly get to know these people, you'll have no idea the talents that they possess, and those talents that could be leveraged for your organization to both the company's benefit and to their benefit, right? So that they can get recognized for doing something that they're deeply passionate about, but also benefits the company, right? And so, again, we get back to, again, it seems to always come back to building trust in the team, right? They're not going to tell you that they have these skills unless they trust you with them. They're willing to have those conversations with you, right? So there are some talented people at probably the lowest levels of your organization. In fact, probably the people that are most in tune with a problem that you might be having in your organization, those folks at the lowest levels of the organization are probably the ones that have the best ideas on how to solve that problem.
They're usually right next to it. They are experiencing it face to face on a regular basis, and they're not at a place in an organization where the information is either filtered before it gets to them, or they maybe haven't learned yet that in some organizations they want you to filter information going up. So they are the best people to give the most candid feedback.
Yeah. But and again, I mean, this gets back to sort of emotional intelligence and the ego of a leader. You kind of have to be okay. We certainly want our workforce to do things in a respectful way, but we as leaders also have to be okay with acknowledging that our workforce is going to challenge us, and they should challenge us, because it's going to make the organization better. If they really force you to think about the decision that you're about to make, and they challenge you on that, then I think you can take comfort in at least knowing all the cards are on the table, right? You have all the information that you should have to make a well-informed decision.
It has become slightly more controversial for leaders to say, don't bring me problems unless you also bring me a solution. And I think that kind of what you're talking about there is that piece where we want people to bring up problems to us. We don't need a peanut gallery, right? You're not here to punch holes in things. But if there's a problem and you don't know the solution, as the leader, I probably have a bit more resources that I can look at to find that solution. So I don't know if you kind of heard that evolving more recently. I would say in the past couple of years, I've heard a lot of people say, you're stifling people when you say, don't bring me a problem unless you also bring me a solution, because as the leader, I have more resources to find a solution. So tell me what the problem is.
My advice would certainly be, look, bring me whatever you have to bring me, okay? If you're doing it in a respectful way, whether you have a solution or not, maybe we can put our heads together and come up with a decent enough solution, but it certainly alert me to the fact that there's a problem that I can fix. And then again, going back to this whole, again, as I sort of find my leadership style is more coaching and getting obstacles out of the way so that smart people can do what is sort of in their wheelhouse, because they're the ones that will tip it. Again, in all likelihood, I'm not going to be the person that has the one best solution for the organization. They probably will, or a combination of their ideas will give us a much better solution. And so, what are the obstacles that are in their way that I, as the leader, can help remove? I think that's where I can certainly add value. But again, getting back to your point, if you got a solution, great. I'd love to hear the solution. But at a minimum, I certainly want to know if there's something bad that's about to happen. And this has happened, right? You can pick up the Wall Street Journal on a daily basis and you can hear about somebody who just bit it. They probably wouldn't have been fired. They probably wouldn't have found themselves in hot water had they just had folks who were that trusted in them, that were willing to sort of tell them that there was a problem that they probably should have addressed 3 years ago, right?
And that reminds me of something you had said in the past that I thought was just the most genius thing. I repeat it all the time. As a leader, if you're afraid to lose your position, then you don't deserve it. So I'd love for you to talk more about that too.
Yeah, so again, I've grown up as an acquisitions officer for the last 10 years of my Army career. And so again, as I mentioned, right, we buy stuff and we hope that it's good stuff that we're buying for the war fighter here. There's a lot of money involved with government contracts. So whenever we buy something, right, there's a lot of money involved. And so sometimes contracting officers, acquisition professionals, we sort of get a little risk averse. There's so much money on the line. What if this is the wrong deal? What if we didn't negotiate well enough? All these different things come into play to the point where everybody feels as though if they make a decision, they're going to go to prison. We've almost handcuffed ourselves into just not doing anything. And this is why people complain sometimes about our acquisition life cycle, that it's way too long to sort of award a contract. And it's partially due to this risk aversion that we have. And it's brought on because of this culture of, I don't want to make a decision here because if I do, I'm going to go to jail. Bull crap. Look, yeah, you want to know why you're going to go to jail? You're going to go to jail if there's a conflict of interest. You're going to go to jail if there's a nefarious reason behind a decision that you're making. But I can't think of one case study on poor ethical behavior that involved somebody making a well thought out, principled decision. It may not always go right, but I guarantee you're not going to go to jail. And the advice that I always give folks that are interested in the acquisitions community is, look, before you make the decision, ask yourself, would I feel comfortable getting up on a stand and being questioned by a lawyer and explaining the rationale behind the decision that I'm about to make? And if the rationale is perfectly well justified, then make the decision, right? Make the decision, for crying out loud. Don't waffle, don't waste time, don't drag this thing out any more than it absolutely needs to be dragged out. So again, be well informed, but be principled in your decision making. I think unfortunately what really ends up happening is, on the surface, we tell people the decision that we're making is principled and value-based, and then years later we learn that it was because we were getting a kickback from some company for awarding a contract, right? I challenge anybody, find me one case study of somebody who went to prison or had to pay a fine or who lost their career because they were making a principle-based decision. It doesn't happen. And so again, culturally, we've handcuffed ourselves into just not making decisions because we think we're going to go to jail. Well, crap. You're not going to jail if you make a value-based principled decision. It's not going to happen. You're going to go to jail because there was a conflict of interest. You were hugely unethical. You were collecting money under the table for awarding a contract. That's what you're going to jail for.
I love that. And that's so true, though, but in all areas of leadership and for all leaders. When we get so concerned about the people that we answer to and all these other things, you are put in that position for a reason. Now continue to make great decisions, like you said, that are value-based, principled decisions, and you're going to be fine. Somebody might be mad at you, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Somebody might be sad, and that's okay too. We're going to work through it because we're all adults.
Yeah, and then something else, and again, I think this one sort of transcends military boundaries as well, and I think it's just so relevant in this day and age. When we talk about mentorship and we talk about coaching our most junior people, one of the sort of expressions that I've heard used time and time again is we aspire to be what we can see, right? And so when we don't have African Americans in leadership positions and we don't have women in leadership positions, we typically don't have lower level employees in our workforce who are aspiring for those positions because they don't necessarily have somebody guiding them along. Why don't they have somebody guiding them along? Well, let me share another story with you. So I remember when I was a young officer in the Army, a senior officer, he told me, he said, I will never have a female as my driver. I will never have a female as my driver. And of course, the logic behind his decision was simply, what if she charges me with sexual harassment, right? Then I get fired and I'm just not going to go down that road. So guess what? I'm never going to put female as my driver, a female on my staff, or right, all these things. And again, it took me years to process this, right? To actually sit down and think through that conversation that I had with that officer one day. I think I was at one of our career courses And I remember writing the story down on a notepad because somebody else was giving a presentation. And at the very bottom, I just put bullcrap, right? Like, again, and this gets back to the whole, you know why you're going to go to jail? You know why you're going to lose your job because you had that female as your driver? Because you broke the law, right? Because you sexually harassed that person, right? You did something that you knew you weren't supposed to do. That's why you're going to lose your job. And again, if you're that much of a coward that you don't even want to put yourself in that position, then you absolutely don't deserve your job. Our workforce is just so diverse, and everybody's incentives are kind of a little bit different. You know, what makes them tick is a little bit different. I am still absolutely convinced, certainly in our profession, that, you know, nobody wakes up in the morning, looks at themselves in the mirror and says, gee, I hope I suck today, right? People just don't do that. So everybody wants to be a contributing member to the team. And in some cases, right, when leaders just don't make decisions and organizational growth is stagnated, I mean, that can be soul crushing for morale for people too. If you do have, you know, a leader that just is that risk averse or is just unwilling to sort of make a decision, it can be detrimental to the morale of your workforce. You know, again, how do you get those best ideas to the table? You know, there are online tools that we can use to get things out. There's anonymous platforms, there's blogs and comment sections, right? Because everybody's going to contribute maybe in a different way. And I think, right, that's what we've learned more than anything else. I remind my cadets all the time, you know, it's unfortunate, but I think the culture is shifting. But there used to be this sort of macho bravado. We want leaders who can jump up on the hood of a Humvee, pound their chest, scream really, really loud. And those are the leaders that get promoted. Those are the leaders that get recognized. Meanwhile, 50 to 75% of our workforce is not that kind of person, which means we're probably leaving 75% of the good ideas on the cutting room floor, right? Because they just never make it to a decision maker. And so we've got to be lifelong learners. We've got to be committed to leveraging technology to help us get the best ideas from our workforce. And so a lot of companies have leveraged chat functions or anonymous social media. There was the old anonymous complaint box, right? Drop a little card in the anonymous complaint box. Now we have sort of anonymous online forums. And so sometimes those things can take on a life of their own, but it also does allow us to really put our finger on the pulse of the workforce when we do make decisions, because I guarantee you, when we implement a major decision, the cadets are going to talk about it in the online social media space. So we'll absolutely get a sense of how was it received by the workforce, because they won't tell us to our faces. So yeah, there are casual conversations, getting to know people, but again, leveraging technology to the extent possible, because not everybody is going to be willing to voice that one great idea that's going to change everything in a meeting of all places. I'm lucky if I'm awake 10 minutes into most meetings. So leveraging technology to make sure that we're getting those great ideas from our workforce.
And I like that diversity of options, because I recently reread Liz Wiseman's book, Multipliers. And in it, she's talking about how there are multipliers who increase intelligence and capability among a group. And then there are diminishers who take that away. And diminishers aren't necessarily bad people. They just have behaviors that diminish work. Yeah. And she talks about these accidental diminishers. And so people who seem to be very supportive or very like the rescuer, who they just want everybody to succeed and kind of get to the next place. But what they're really doing is making everybody like codependent on them. And I think that when we kind of look at how we give people options to give feedback and our role as a leader in that process, we can really see how we are multiplying or diminishing. And sometimes it is kind of the platform that you use.
I have a phone in my office right here. I think that I'm confident the phone works. I think it's maybe once over the course of the last 6 months, the phone has actually rung, right? So again, that just speaks to kind of like how we have societally transitioned. We have all these new tools that hopefully we're leveraging to the betterment of the organization.
What leadership advice would you offer a current leader in any organization?
I guess I'll approach it from two different angles or two different parts of the organizations. If you're a junior leader in an organization, or look, if you're just a member of a team, challenge leadership, right? Challenge the decisions, challenge the information that's being disseminated. And as I mentioned earlier, right, be polite, be civil in your discourse, right? we don't want to throw punches or anything like that, but be willing to challenge these authority figures. And I think when I say authority figures, I think that's more sort of relevant to sort of my community, the military community, than maybe it is on the other side. But I still think that there is this era or this sense of, well, that guy is my boss. I'm not going to do anything to upset him because he's my ticket to moving up the corporate ladder, right? So we're unwilling to challenge leadership. Now, the only way that works is if on the other end of the spectrum, we have senior leaders who have a high degree of emotional intelligence, who can check their ego at the door. And so when they are challenged by their workforce, they don't get defensive, right? They don't dig their heels in and resist or fight. They receive it, they listen. That's an interesting thought. I had not considered that. And they take it home with them and they think about it a little bit more, and they come back the next day and, oh, by the way, they were willing to have their minds changed. They were willing to be persuaded. So yeah, the advice that I would give is to, right, on one end of the spectrum, challenge leadership, challenge information, challenge decisions. And then on the other end of the spectrum, be willing to be challenged, because it doesn't work if you're just going to put these people in their places and go tell them to stand in the corner, right? That's not going to work. When you do that, right, then we just lose any sense of trust and cohesiveness with our teams.
Which leader has insight that you have found to be valuable to your leader development?
I think it's worth mentioning this one, because when you talked about the individual who responded in the moment to the question with a, hey, I'll get back to you sort of response, it reminded me of John McCain when he's running for president in that 2000, I guess it was the 2007, 2008 campaign against Obama, right? There's this town hall meeting that he's hosting. And there's this woman that steps up to the microphone and she makes this comment. She says something like, I don't like Senator Obama, he's a Muslim and he's a terrorist and he's just a bad human being. And John McCain walks up in that moment and he takes the microphone from this woman. He says something like, no, he's a good and respectable family man. We just disagree on the direction our country should go in. In that moment, right, in this sort of red meat political sort of arena that we seem to operate in today, and thinking about the story that you had just shared, right, in that moment, that moment, for that to happen requires an awful lot of just emotional intelligence to just shift gears away from what is about to become an incredibly awkward conversation and to just, hey, this isn't the direction that I want to go, right? That was I talk about value-based and principle-based decision-making. In that moment, that was a value-based decision-making to sort of not go down that road. So just thinking about sort of influential leaders, I mean, that's a pretty profound moment in political history, but I think from a leadership moment to sort of, shift gears and be civil. We talk a little bit about just civility in the workplace, but just civil society, civil workplaces where people can share and exchange ideas and it doesn't get wildly heated and people don't go home mad at each other. The other sort of leader that I would point to as somebody that has had some influence on me, probably much lesser known maybe than John McCain. So my former business school dean, Mark Zupan. So Mark Zupan is now the president of Alfred University. But when I went to the Simon School of Business in 2012, I remember having an office call with him one day. We talked about my military background. He shared with me some things that he had learned from the military that he still uses in his day-to-day business work, the after action reviews and growing from various operations that your company runs. But then he recommended a book to me. And the next week I got the book and read through it. The title was Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And it was a deliberately chosen book for me because he knew the culture that I was coming from. And he knew the culture of the business school community that I was now joining. And I wouldn't say that they were night and day, but there were some huge differences in the types of people that were my classmates in business school and the folks that I had worked alongside of for the first half of my military career. And so I found that book to be profound, but what I also found to be profound was the fact that that was a book recommendation that he gave to me that was individually tailored for me, right? He had the presence, we talked about leadership is hard, right? The better you are at it, the harder it is. He knew my background. He knew after having this conversation with me, he had recommended this book for me. And we've talked an awful lot today, actually, about concepts that I have extracted from that book that I've incorporated into my leadership style, right? To sort of get the most out of your workforce. And so, again, the book is a great reference if folks out there listening haven't read it. I think it's a very interesting and powerful book, right? Like, there are people out there that just aren't willing to communicate in an open forum. It's terrifying for them. But that also means that you're probably leaving 50% of the good ideas in somebody's brain somewhere, and you're not getting them to the surface.
So with that, do you have a specific book or resource that you would recommend?
Yeah, so in addition to that, Thinking Fast and Slow is both a book and a resource. In fact, it's certainly not a book that you should read in one sitting. Because what it does, and I use it day in and day out as a tool, and I present a lot of the material from the book in my classes or when I'm having conversations with some folks. But what it does is it opens our eyes up to our blind spots. I think that's what the book is helpful in doing. And so as a leader, as society evolves, as technology evolves, as organizations evolve, there are going to be more and more blind spots in your leadership style, in your decision-making style, right? If you know your biases, if you know the direction you are typically inclined to go and the pitfalls associated with that, then you can maybe redirect or ask for help and bring somebody else along on the decision-making ride with you. So that book is very, very helpful as both a book, but also as a valuable resource for leaders.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Equipping Leaders. This season, there is an associated blog for each podcast episode, which can be found on my website, natashacheyenne.com, under Leadership Journal. My website also features other leadership development content, such as frameworks, book recommendations, a weekly newsletter, and other downloadable content. You can also follow me on Instagram at novel_Natasha and on Twitter and Facebook at Natasha Cheyenne. Join me next week for another episode.